is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Dolohungva. The Canadian government is providing $75 million in relief funds to support Indigenous people who live in the cities. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced the additional funding is specifically for Indigenous organizations providing services for people living in the urban areas. Trudeau said COVID-19 is having a unique impact on this group that's separated from their communities. He said they may have challenges getting the help they need. Trudeau said, quote, "That is why we are supporting organizations that play essential roles in their lives and give a helping hand in providing crucial services to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis during this difficult time." Back in March, the Government of Canada announced $305 million for the nation's Indigenous communities. $15 million was set aside for the urban Indigenous people. The additional funding will continue to support community-based projects that address the critical needs of Indigenous populations during this pandemic. Electing a new tribal council will look different this time for the Pasquayaqui tribe in Arizona. For the first time, the tribe is offering drive-through voting due to the pandemic. This early voting option starts today. Poll workers will wear masks and gloves and give drive-through voters hand sanitizers when they arrive. Voters will be given a ballot, an envelope, and a pencil which they don't need to return. However, in-person voting is still an option. The tribe's election is Monday, June 1st. For the latest numbers of COVID-19 in Indian Country, let's go to Jordan Benebigay, our Washington editor. Jordan?
Yate Patty, Yate Shikis Do Shidineen. So during the long weekend, 3 tribes reported more COVID-19 cases, and here are the latest numbers from our database. There are 6,619 positive confirmed cases and 217 deaths in the Indian health system. Again, that is a total of 6,619 positive confirmed cases and 217 deaths as of this morning. In Arizona, the White Mountain Apache tribe saw a rise in 98 cases and had 2 additional deaths. This gives the tribe a total of 615 cases and 6 deaths. One of those 6 deaths was a tribal citizen who lived off the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. The Navajo Nation that spans across Arizona and parts of New Mexico and Utah reported 360 new cases and 10 additional deaths from Friday to Monday. And in New Mexico, Quechua Pueblo's health center had 9 more positive confirmed cases. 5 of these 9 cases live in the Quechua Pueblo community, while the other 4 live outside the Pueblo. And Indian Country Today still includes these 9 cases since these are tribal health resources. And Indian Country Today does try its best to keep up with these numbers daily. We try to confirm the numbers with the tribes themselves and through the press releases released by the tribes and the updates that they give their tribal citizens. We also receive submissions from Google Forms on our syllabus, and the syllabus can be found on our platform when you swipe left 3 times on our platform if you're on your phone. And individuals can also email, they submit the Google form or email us case updates too, which we always appreciate that and still confirm the numbers for those. And lastly, family and friends are welcome to submit obituaries, and we post obituaries with a photo submitted to obituary at indiancountrytoday.com at no cost. And these individuals are part of our Portraits from the Pandemic, where we are showing the world that these individuals are more than statistics and they are Native people with stories.
Right, so we've been posting some of those obituaries there. And we're also hearing from tribes who are continuing to keep extending their stay-at-home orders. I know at Hopi, one village, Sangopavi, just extended their stay-at-home until July 21st. Are you hearing from other tribes as well extending their stay-at-home?
I'm hearing this over here and there, like seeing on social media. I don't have any specific tribes right now, but I know a lot of casinos are looking at trying to reopen at this point with some restrictions or some guidelines that the state is giving them.
Right, so we're going to monitor that as well and follow the story on casino reopening here. So what else are we working on, Jordan?
We have a lot of stories that people are working. We're also keeping an eye on the election right now. And, former Vice President Joe Biden is the potential Democratic nominee. So one of our reporters is looking at the reactions from Indian Country in that because a lot of Indian Country did favor Bernie Sanders we're trying to, stay updated on that story as well, and just other, data stories that are happening with the virus in Indian country.
And also, finally, the census. We're following that too. Jordan Benebigay, thank you so much.
Yeah, Patty.
And we'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
Welcome back. Nearly 3 years ago, one man was sounding the alarm and telling the president that it was more than likely he would deal with the pandemic in his term than deal with the terrorist attack. He warned about cutting funds to programs that study infectious diseases, to no avail. Now he's working on congressional funding to help bail out people, businesses, and communities as the coronavirus sweeps across the country. We welcome Congressman Tom Cole to our program today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
What has been your biggest frustration in this pandemic and how the administration has dealt with it?
Well, probably my biggest frustration is we should have been better prepared than we are. Now, to be fair, in the last 5 years, and this has been due to bipartisan work in Congress, we've increased the spending at the National Institute of Health by 39%, the strategic stockpile by 34%, the Center for Disease Control by 24% in 5 years. And we also set up the Infectious Disease Rapid Response Fund, which enabled us to start deploying money immediately as opposed to waiting for Congress to act. So all those were good things. But even with that, this pandemic managed to grind to a halt the largest economy in the world in a period of about 12 weeks. And we're still suffering from that. So it just reinforces that we needed to do more in retrospect than we did. And again, we did quite a bit, but it just frankly wasn't enough. So I would hope going forward, we have frankly not just investments dealing with this pandemic, but we need to reinvest in the public healthcare system in the United States. It's simply not robust enough to deal with something like this. We know we're likely to have a second wave of COVID-19, and you just never know what the biosphere is going to throw at you, so to speak. You just know something's coming. We've had SARS, we've had MERS, we've had Zika, we've had Ebola. Now we have coronavirus. So you just have to recognize this is the reality of life, and you have to prepare to protect our citizens the same way we do militarily, that is with a really robust investment.
And why is it important to help other countries prepare for pandemics?
Well, I always tell people, would you rather fight Ebola in West Africa or West Dallas? We've seen from coronavirus how rapidly disease can move across the globe. So anytime we have a chance to deal with something at the point of origin, we are much better off as a country, assuming it's outside the United States. Indeed, that was one of the problems with coronavirus. The Chinese, quite frankly, were not honest with their neighbors, with the World Health Organization, certainly not with us, about how serious it was. They're obligated by treaty to within 24 hours notify anybody of an outbreak. And of course, we now know they even imprisoned some of their own doctors that were warning them something new is happening here that we don't understand. So that let it get started in the most populous country in the world, and a country that sends its citizens all over the world on a routine basis. And it spread pretty rapidly after that. So again, we're always better off dealing with something at the point of origin. And we have the ability, quite frankly, as a country to do things that, perhaps in Africa or, Bangladesh or places that are genuinely poor, they just simply don't have the public health resources that we do, the research capacity that we do. So, I believe in the biblical injunction, to those who much is given, much is expected. We've been given much as a country. We need to play our role globally in dealing with pandemics.
What do you say to people who say this is just a conspiracy? It's manufactured.
Well, 100,000 deaths are hard to call a conspiracy. To compare that, we've been in wars overseas, wars on terror since 9/11. We've lost 7,000 Americans in those situations. Those are terrible numbers. That's 7,000, though, in about 20 years. We've lost 100,000 people in less than 3 months inside the United States. And so this is no conspiracy. This is a dangerous virus, more infectious than anything we've probably seen in 100 years since the great influenza in 1918 to 1920. And it's something that we need to take seriously. It looks like we're starting to get on top of it. It doesn't look like it mutates as fast as viruses usually do. That's a good thing. It'll help us develop both therapeutics to treat it and, more importantly, a vaccine to protect everybody. But again, these things can evolve very rapidly. And how anybody could call it a conspiracy, I think you'd almost have to be deliberately misinformed.
Now, when it comes to funding and the continued funding, the Senate says it's not going to consider a next funding bill. What happens now?
Well, I actually think there will be another bill. I think the initial, and it's too bad we broke the sequence. I always remind people, coming right out of impeachment, where you're really very divided in an election year, Congress produced 4 supplementals in a row with almost no partisan dissent in either the House or the Senate. Almost everybody from both sides of the aisle voted for all 4 of those. The most recent one, for whatever reason, Democrats decided to push ahead. There wasn't any negotiation with the Republicans. And it doesn't mean, by the way, people will agree on everything. They don't. But they didn't agree on everything in the previous 4 either, but they sat down and worked through the differences. I think we'll do that again. I would expect a bill either in the latter half of June or certainly in July before the August break. I think it'll be a large bill. Might not be the $3 trillion bill that the House produced, in this last episode, but it'll be pretty substantial, and it will have help for state and localities and tribal governments. That's very important for us to make sure that we stay at the table. In the CARES bill, that's actually the largest transfer of wealth from the federal government to tribal governments in American history. And doesn't mean it's enough or it makes up for what's happened in the past. It certainly doesn't. But we were very successful in a bipartisan way and a bicameral way in getting at the table and making sure that Indian country got an adequate piece of the resources for one of the first times in our history.
Is it ironic to you that it took a pandemic for Congress to live up to its treaty obligation?
It is.
It's not even actually
and I wouldn't say we lived up to them.
Yeah.
We did a better job this time. But it's a sad thing, but 230 odd years of American history teaches you that we've never lived up to our trust obligations. And we've always had an overbearing attitude toward tribal governments at the federal and particularly even more the state level. So, that's a fight you have to fight every day. I'm just saying in this particular incidents, we actually did a little bit better than I think most people realize. $8 billion is out of a $150 billion pot of money for state and local and tribal governments. Again, it's better than twice the size of the Cobell settlement. It's the largest federal payment in history. So a lot of people worked very hard to make that happen. A lot of people deserve credit, native and non-native alike. But, we ought to recognize we did well this time. We ought to be determined that whatever is done in the next bill, we hold the percentage, we stay at the table, and tribal governments continue to get the financial support that they both deserve and frankly need to deal with this kind of crisis.
But Congressman, 45% of that $8 billion is still being held up in court, and they're still deciding whether or not Alaska Native corporations will get that money.
Exactly. Well, about 40%, but it's still a very substantial amount of money. You're exactly right. And that's, we just have to fight this out. Now, my hope is by early June, that'll be settled. The administration actually did not go as far in helping Alaska Native corporations as I think most people thought they would. I personally believe the main intent here was to help tribal governments and to deal with this crisis, not private corporation. Alaska Native corporations are private corporations and they're not totally Indian owned. So again, there's a place for them at the table, but this money clearly needed to go to tribal government. So I'm hopeful we can work through the legal problems. Treasury has tried to work with us, tried to get the money out of the door, but there's time. And remember, it's tribes, a number of tribes and Alaska Native villages that brought the suit in the first place. I'm not being critical of them. We have every right to litigate their positions, but the federal government has to wait until that's solved. So this is just one of those cases you wish we'd had a stronger definition going in, so congressional intent was clearer. I think that'll probably happen in the next bill. So you learn lessons every time. But again, it's still, we've gotten, roughly $5 billion out the door to Indian country. So that's a good start.
Well, how did that definition end up in the bill anyway that included Alaska Native?
Well, I think it was negotiated mostly in the Senate. I don't think it would have gotten through the House. And look, I'm never critical of people that represent their constituencies. The Alaskans are pretty good at representing their constituencies. I just think we have a deeper knowledge in the House. We have 4 tribal members in the House, 2 in each party. They're all 4 deeply involved in Native American affairs. Deb Howland and I co-chair the Native American Caucus together. So I think that would have been tough to get through here, but they got it through the Senate. We didn't have a chance to amend it in the House, although I did put a colloquy, as it's called, in the official record, claiming, and it was what I think was the intent, that this was meant for tribal governments, not for private entities. So hopefully we'll get this straightened out in the court system. I think we will. And I think we have a much better definition of how to distribute the money now, but we can do better still in the next piece of legislation.
And when did you say you think that litigation will conclude?
I think we'll conclude, and this is a guess. Again, I'm not an attorney, and they can make these things go on longer, but I think early June. I think there's a target to try and get the money out the door. Again, I think Treasury and certainly Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service are well aware of the serious situation that we're facing. And some of this is conditioned on the size of tribal economies too, and tribal workforces. A lot of our tribes are keeping their people working, native and non-native alike, at safe casinos with no revenue. So they need that revenue to be able to sustain their economic base as well as deal with the virus itself.
Mm-hmm. And because of all of this blow up over the $8 billion and going to Alaska Native corporations, several tribes are now calling for the removal of Tariff Sweeney. Where do you stand on that?
I'm not in favor of that. Look, I think, again, at the end of the day, the decisions were made in the Treasury. They were not, and that's where, frankly, most of the decisions have been made involving coronavirus relief. That's not unusual. The money has been placed there. So, it's a difficult issue. People wrestle with it. And we do have conflicts inside of Indian country. Not a big surprise when you have well over 500 different nations with very different circumstances, very different interests, and very different histories, cultures, and traditions in some cases. So, and again, we've never had this amount of money made available to Indian country at one time in the past. So that's going to create some conflict. I think we'll work through it. I think it'll go smoother the next time. And again, I'm all for helping corporations and businesses. They employ people. And there's a lot of money in the CARES Act just for that. Everything from the Paycheck Protection Program, which, by the way, that was a fight to make sure that tribes with small casinos, people under 500 employees, could also apply for that. That took us several weeks to get done, but we finally won the fight. The Small Business Administration has never given loans to any entity that gets more than 30% of its income from gaming. Now, there's no law to that effect. That's just departmental policy, if you will. So we had to fight that fight. But eventually, Treasury looked at it our way. That was a big help to, I was talking to San Carlos Apaches, made a big difference to them, made a big difference to some of the smaller tribes in my home state of Oklahoma. So again, we're winning some of these fights. It's just taking us longer than I would like. But each one we win sets a good precedent and helps us for the next one.
Let's talk. Let's talk about education now, and education funding for BIE schools. What does that look like for this next semester?
Well, I think probably in a sense, BIE schools are probably going to be better off than some local schools, simply because they don't depend on state appropriations. And we know state governments have been decimated. We did put in some extra money in the CARES Act for education of all kinds. Not enough in my view, but I think we'll be able to come back. But again, our biggest problems in the BIE system are just historic underfunding. That's true in Indian healthcare. That's true in everything. So you can't make up. It's one of our challenges. Even if you give enough money in this crisis, if there's not a strong infrastructure there, really good facilities, really, appropriate personnel with the type of numbers. Well, the money alone can't make up for historic patterns of neglect. And
Sure.
we have those all through Indian country on these very basic services.
Now, some states are in the process of reopening, and yet tribes are still under stay-at-home orders. When do you know it's safe to reopen for Indian country?
Well, I think it will vary very much by where you're at. If you're a tribe in New York State, which has been hit very hard, it might be very different. We certainly, much tougher in Navajo country than almost any other part of Indian country. So they may want to approach this differently. Oklahoma, where we have a very substantial Native population, 39 tribes, over 400,000 tribal members, we have not been hit as hard. Now, some of our tribal areas have been hit a little bit harder than the state on average, but we still have barely 300 deaths in a population of 4 million and about 5,500 cases. Compare that to New York with double the New York City by itself has over 22,000 dead and it's 8 million people. So again, I think each tribe needs to make its own decisions based on the best data we can give them. We have put extra money in the Indian Health Service for tribes. We did put extra money for tribal hospitals, set aside in the money for hospitals. So hopefully that and better data, and it's very tough, particularly the parts of Indian country that are remote, to get the kind of testing that you need. It's very difficult. But
let's talk about the election now.
To be making those decisions, they're closer to the people.
Right. So we're in an election year, and you've been very supportive of the president. Are you campaigning for him?
But I certainly support the president, and I will campaign for him. Look, I don't think it's an accident we got this $8 billion. I give actually Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff, who used to represent the Eastern Band of Cherokee. He learned a lot about tribal governments doing that. And I appealed to him directly during the course of this negotiation. One point, our share was down to as little as $2.3 billion. He and the White House intervened and helped get that up. So did a lot of Republican and Democratic senators. This was a bipartisan effort. I think Indian issues are always bipartisan. They don't fall along Republican, Democrat, or liberal conservative lines. They're really about, do you believe in the trust responsibility, and do you respect tribal sovereignty? And I find people in both parties that do, and frankly, I find people in both parties that do not.
And this year, there are, I think, like 15 Native Americans running for both Congress and the U.S. Senate.
I think that's great news for us. And I can tell you, it made an enormous, I was up here as the only tribal member for a number of years. And it made a difference when Mark Wayne Mullen, Cherokee from Eastern Oklahoma, arrived. It made a tremendous difference last election when Sharice Davids and Deb Haaland arrived here. That gave us our first 2 Native American women in history. There's only been 16 tribal members in the history of Congress that have served. I always like to point out 8 from Oklahoma, so I'm very proud of that. But only 16, and this was our first 2 women, but they're in the majority caucus, and they've had an enormous impact on everything from COVID-19 relief to VAWA to other tribal issues, broadband, and Deb Haaland has done such a great job on. So We're
Right.
working well together, and I think we're
We
getting a
have
lot done.
just a little bit of time left, and I really want to ask you about the books that you're reading, because I can't believe that you have time for books. But really quickly, Congressman
Oh,
Tom.
well, I always read book. I just finished a book by a guy named Richard Fenno. He died recently. He was the #1 student of Congress. This was called Challenges in the Representation or Congressional Representation. Is his last book. And I've just started a book by Jonathan Carl called Front Row at the Trump Show. He's a ABC reporter down there and a pretty smart guy, and one that I think has good insight into politics.
All right. Well, Representative Tom Cole from Oklahoma, thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. My privilege.
And thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Tolahungva. Join us again tomorrow.
This is Indian Country Today.